Alright, so we're back. Sorry that I missed a week. I've been kind of under the weather. Was in bed last week, so we're back though, and we'll be in Acts chapter 37. Sorry, Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 37. Alright, let's dive in. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. And with great power the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had any need. Thus Joseph, who is also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, sold a field that belonged to him, and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. So we get into a little intermission from the rest of the action here in Acts. We've been fast-paced, and Luke gives us a slight little break just to kind of give a summary. So we see a summary, and we're looking in verse 32. It says, "Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul." So these believers are working together. They're growing together, like as one heart and as one soul. They're living in community. These guys are close-knit at this point. They're taking care of each other. They're praying for each other. They're learning with each other. And they had all things in common. And with great power the apostles were giving their testimonies to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. They're continuing steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine still, which is the idea of Jesus and his teaching and his resurrection. That was the early church. That was what the early church was built upon. Alright, so we look at Matthew 16, verse 16 through 18, and this is Jesus talking, right, or Jesus talking about Peter. In verse 15, he asks the apostles, "But who do you say that I am?" And this is what Peter answered in verse 16. Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Jesus is saying that the church is built upon the doctrine of who Jesus is. That ultimately is what we believe in. That is at the core of what our religion is. It's built on. On verse 34, we pick back up, and it talks about there was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet. And this is when things get a little bit messy. We get into the territory of this is something that maybe God didn't necessarily call them to do. Chuck Smith said it this way: "Nothing is said as to whether this is a command of God, or even being spirit-led. In fact, even the opposite seems to be indicated by Peter in his questioning of Ananias." That's what he's talking about in Acts 5:4. So Chuck Smith doesn't think that this was how God wanted this to work. At the very least, it was not something forced. God gives us the right to own property, and we do see that philosophy created issues, including with Ananias and Caiaphas, and them keeping money for themselves. But Luke also makes mention to Barnabas, and this giving was not mandatory, but it was commended. Just like offering is not commanded. It's not commanded, but it is encouraged. God gives us so much. Why can't we give a little bit back of what we have to him? The Bible mentions specifically what Barnabas did, and we see in verse 36, "Thus Joseph, who is also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, sold the field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet." I think it is worth noting that he did not sell everything he had. He just sold one of his fields. He could have kept that property for himself, but again, he knew that others needed it, and he selflessly gave. And that right there, I think, is what offering should be more like. Is someone that has money that God has given them, and then they give it selflessly. It shouldn't be something that is forced out of anyone, because it is ultimately God's given it to us, so we should give it back, right? I do think it's important because Barnabas, again, didn't sell everything. God gives us the right to own property and the right to take care of ourselves. And I think when everyone was selling everything they had, there's a lot of people who would be ultimately, if things fell apart, would be left with nothing. So I do actually think it's quite important that Barnabas kept some of his properties in place. That way, if something was to happen and let's just say they got robbed or some of them got killed, the apostles got whatever it is, there's things that could happen. That way he still can take care of himself and his family and others ultimately. So hope you guys enjoyed this one, and hopefully we'll be back next week. Again, sorry about missing last week. It was not much fun, but hope you all are doing well, and I'll see you later.